Commander is a mostly casual format designed for slower games where more expensive cards can shine. The format still has a ban list to help regulate it, though how and why they ban cards is very different. So, this bit of the series will be a bit different, and rather than talking about if a card could be unbanned, we'll be discussing the pros and cons of potential bans and unbans. First, we're going to go over some of the cards that simply don't translate well to the format very well. And starting off, we have Trade Secrets. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 2 blue. It has the effect where target player draws 2 cards. Then you draw up to 4 cards. Then your opponent can choose to repeat this process as many times as they want. This card was banned in April of 2013. Now, why is Trade Secrets banned? Well, the main issue is that it has really bad play patterns in a multiplayer game. Normally, repeating the card draw off of secrets won't be too great, as it would always give your opponent more cards than you did. If you just said yes until you drew your entire deck, your opponent would have just as many cards as you did, so you wouldn't really be getting anywhere. Even worse, since they built their deck around Trade Secrets, it's more likely they'll have something more broken to do with all the cards you just gave them than you do. However, in Commander, deck building and card advantage in general just work differently. While you're going down cards to one of your opponents, you're going up cards against both of the 2 other players on the table. This alone makes taking the deal a lot more attractive. However, the option of drawing your entire deck is also a lot more feasible. In Commander, most decks are built to go over the top, or have something very, very powerful they can do if they find the right cards. So, if your opponent decides to draw their entire deck alongside the Trade Secrets player, they'll both be in a position to win the game. What this means is that, for your opponent that's targeted by secrets, you can essentially go from having a 25% chance to win to a 50% chance to win right then and there, because no matter what happens, either you or the person who casts secrets will almost certainly win. This means that in Commander, secrets leads to a lot of games where 2 players draw their whole deck and have a game between each other and simply leave the other 2 players in the dust. And this isn't even getting into the political aspects. It's very easy to negotiate a situation where the 2 players who draw off of secrets agree to help each other, or not kill each other for a turn, or to focus on one of the other 2 players who are a bigger threat at the moment, or any number of other things. These political deals are common in Commander, but Trade Secrets is simply too big of a bargaining chip. Trade Secrets made the game about it and only it far too much, and was too disruptive to the game it was played in, so the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Trade Secrets? The only real pro in my eyes is that having fewer cards banned is generally considered good, as it makes things like remembering the ban list easier and allows for more creative deck building. This, of course, applies to every card and isn't really enough of a reason to unban a card in my eyes. The card still has all the same issues. The game hasn't really changed since Trade Secrets was banned, and in fact it's probably gotten even worse. Decks have been trending up in power level as the format has progressed, with more and more players playing things like fast mana and infinite combos, and if you're not the player who was targeted by Trade Secrets, then there's not much you can really do to counterplay. Trade Secrets is a great example of the kind of card that needs to be banned, not because it's too good, but because the type of game it creates is very unhealthy. Next up, we have Prophet of Cruix. This is a 2/3 human wizard with a mana cost of 3, 1 green, and 1 blue. It has the abilities where you untap all creatures and lands you control during each other player's untapped steps, and you can cast creature spells as though they had flash. This means you can play them at any time you could cast an instant. This card was banned in January of 2016. Now, why was Prophet of Cruix banned? Prophet allows you to play on your opponent's turn, something that gets exponentially better the more players are in the game. The ability to untap all your lands and creatures as well as cast creatures on each other's turns basically lets you take a turn on your opponent's turns. The only real downsides are that you can't cast sorcery spell speeds besides creatures, you don't get to draw a card, and you can't attack or activate planeswalkers. Even with these restrictions, you can still do quite a lot. This leads to a very strange issue that we don't see on many cards. Essentially, it leads to one player hogging all the time in the game. There's a sort of unspoken design rule in Magic and most other games that each player is supposed to be able to play the game for around the same amount of time. Of course, there's variance here. Decks that play on your opponent's turn more will hog up a bit more time, and decks that love to tap out will take up less time. However, there is a breaking point, and Prophet of Cruix goes over that line. Getting to take a mini turn on each other player's turn lopsided that balance entirely. This is made even worse by the colors Prophet is in. Blue-green are famous for generating absurd board states in Commander by combining green's mana ramp and great creatures with blue's card draw. Prophet lets you take this to 11, casting even more creatures and drawing even more cards. Possibly the worst thing about Prophet is that since it untaps all your lands right away, it gives you the mana needed to cast counterspells back. There's not even a single second where your shields are down and your opponents have gotten to untap. They need to have an instant speed answer to Cruix to be able to play around your counter magic. All this together led to Prophet taking over games far too much, so the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Prophet? One big argument for unbanning Prophet is that cards like Seedborn Muse basically have half the effect of Prophet. By combining this with Vidalcan Orrery, which gives all your cards flash, you can basically build your own profit. However, the difficulty in actually being able to do this means that the comparison is pretty mute. Seedborn Muse alone doesn't create the slowdown in the games that Profit does, and needing the second card makes the card very difficult to actually put this together. So it doesn't cause the issues that Profit does. The other big argument in favor of unbanning the card is that the format has gotten a lot stronger since the card's ban. Games tend to go a lot faster, so some people might argue that the format's in a position that can handle the card better. However, this doesn't seem that likely. While the format has gotten faster, the card is most problematic at lower power level tables, and those tend to be a lot slower and have worse answers overall. So, Profit would more likely than not cause all the same problems it used to if it were unbanned, just at fewer tables. Next up we have Luttree the Spell Chaser. This is a 3/2 legendary elemental otter with a mana cost of 1 and 2 hybrid blue-red mana. It has Companion. Each non-land card in your starting deck has a different name. This means that if you meet the card's Companion requirement, you can start with it outside the game. During your turn, you can pay 3 generic mana to put Luttree into your hand from outside the game, and you can only have 1 Companion. It has Flash and the ability where, whenever it enters the battlefield, you copy a target instant or sorcery spell you control, and you can choose new targets for the copy. This card was banned before its release on April 2nd of 2020, right as it was revealed for the next set. Now, why was Luttree banned so quickly? Well, the card was basically free for any blue-red deck to run. Since Commander is a singleton format, every deck automatically meets Luttree's Companion requirement. However, to run a card in Commander, it has to be within your Commander's color identities. So Luttree was basically a free card that every blue-red deck could run. Even worse, there were some really powerful things you could do with the card. Every blue-red deck is going to have tons of powerful instants and sorceries for you to copy. One great example is just about any extra turn spell. Most of these cost about 5 mana, and getting to take 2 extra turns for 8 mana can often give you the extra push you need to win the game. The issue is just that Luttree gives this kind of advantage to decks playing a specific color. The thing about companions is that there's not really any disadvantage to running them outside of the deck building restrictions, and when you have a card like Luttree who has no real deck building costs, the card becomes all upsides. It would result in certain decks just having a massive upside for no reason, so they decided to ban the card. What are the arguments for unbanning Luttree? This may seem very silly, but Luttree is very cute. There are a lot of people who just really like the card and want to play it either as a commander or in the 99, which isn't problematic in the slightest, but is currently not allowed. It would be nice for those people for Luttree to be unbanned. You could introduce a banned as companion, but the RC got rid of the banned as commander list a while back, and Luttree would be the only card ever to be added to this list. So it's a very weird solution to try and implement. If it could be constrained to the main deck or the commander, Luttree would be fine. So while this rule would be strange, it's also the best way to allow the card to be legal, and there's no real world where the card is legal while also being allowed to be a companion. Next, we have Caracus. This is a legendary land with no land types. It has the ability where you can tap it to add 1 white mana, and you can also tap it to bounce target legendary creature. This card was banned in September of 2008. Now, why was Caracus banned? This one is pretty intuitive. Commander is a format balanced around each player having access to a legendary creature at all time. Making a land that can simply tap to remove one of those creatures is extremely disruptive. The card is disruptive to any game of Commander it gets played in, and that's not even getting into any of the ways to make the card better, such as untapping it to machine gun remove all your opponent's commanders, or bouncing your own legendaries with it to give you more value. The card was a pretty obvious ban in a format built around legendary creatures, as the card's value increases by way too much. What are the arguments for unbanning Caracus? The main argument in favor of unbanning the card is that there are other cards that do very similar things that aren't banned. The big one is Draneth Magistrate, a card that prevents players from casting spells from anywhere other than their hand. This also prevents players from casting spells from the command zone, shutting down commanders entirely. The main difference is that Magistrate is a lot easier to remove. Every color gets some way to deal with creatures, while only some colors get answers to lands. There are few ways to answer colorless lands, but they're far more rare than creature removal. It's far more reasonable to expect people to have creature removal than removal for lands. The other cards that prevent players from playing their commander this way are either far more narrow or way easier to deal with, or more often than not, both. So it makes sense that Caracus is the only card of this type that is currently banned. Next up, we have Limited Resources. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 white. It has abilities where, when it enters the battlefield, each player chooses 5 lands they control and sacrifice the rest, and players can't play lands if there are 10 or more lands in the battlefield. The card was banned in June of 2008. Now, why was Limited Resources banned? The card can make it really hard for players to play the game, mostly due to the second line of text on the card. Forcing players to sack down to give lands really isn't much of an issue, as cards like Cataclysm do far worse. The issue is how easily it can prevent players from playing any additional lands at all. You see, the card was designed around a 2-player game, where both players have 5 lands would add up to a total of 10. So if you blew up one of their lands after playing limited resources, you could just play another one. However, in a 4-player game, there would be 20 lands in the battlefield. This means you could just blow up all of one player's lands and they wouldn't be able to play anymore, since there would still be around 20 lands in the battlefield. This led to a lot of really bad games, where 1 or 2 players were just locked out of the game, and the other 2 or 3 players just played without them. Due to creating all these lopsided games, the card was banned. What are the arguments in favor of unbanning limited resources? There are a few, and truthfully, I think Commander could benefit from this kind of effect. For one, players often play tons of ramp spells in the form of artifact ramp that can let them play under resources. Even if your opponent blows up all your lands, if you have a few signets and mana rocks in play, you can still at least play the game. Additionally, if you can just answer resources before they get rid of all your lands, you can stop yourself from being locked. However, the biggest reason why people want the card banned is that there aren't many good ways to punish land-based ramps in the format. Artifact ramp is often far more susceptible to removal, whereas lands are usually safe. This has led green decks to be generally considered the best in the format, since players don't really have a good way to counter all their ramp, and having a surplus of mana is a really good way to win a game of Commander. However, while all of this is true, and resources could fill an important niche in the format, it's still probably a bit too disruptive to unban. While you can get around it with artifact ramp, I did say this is generally a lot easier to deal with than someone's lands. A single Vandablast going uncountered leaves you completely unable to play the game at all. And the fact that you can answer a card doesn't necessarily mean that it's practical. The player probably already got all their value off of playing the card the first time, and they only spend 1 mana on the card. Using a naturalized effect to answer it leaves you in a really unenviable spot. As much as I want this effect backed, ultimately it just makes far more sense to try to get Wizards to retrain the effect into a less disruptive card, rather than unbanning this version of the effect. And finally, we have Sundine Titan. This is a 7/10 golem artifact creature with a mana cost of 8. It is the ability where, whenever it enters or leaves the battlefield, you select a land of each basic land type and destroy them. This card was banned in June of 2012. Why was Sundine Titan to ban? Titan was really good at destroying all of your opponent's lands, but leaving yours alone. Usually, Titan is a bit of a slow and clunky card, and will usually cost you a few lands of your own too. However, in a 4-player game, it's more likely that you can only choose your opponent's lands to blow up. This makes getting a ton of Titan triggers a lot more attractive. The thing that makes Titan crazy is that it triggers when it enters and leaves the battlefield. So with a card like Conjurer's Closet, you can get 2 Titan triggers a turn, letting you blow up a total of 10 lands. Each flicker effect gives you 2 triggers, letting you do a ton of damage to your opponent's mana bases with just Titan and a few extra cards. The worst things about all of this is that Sundine Titan is colorless, so it can be played in every deck. Combining all these things leads to a card being banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Sundine Titan? There are other similar game-winning land destruction effects available. Combining Heroic Intervention with Armageddon is basically just an I win the game button, blowing up all of your opponent's lands and leaving yours alone. The ability to get rid of all of your opponent's lands with a combo isn't anything new, so Titan being banned for that reason seems a bit strange, to tell the truth. It seems like it's banned more for its fair case, but the fair case isn't all that impressive, so the card being banned while not even being the best land destruction lock in the format is a little weird. Being colorless may make people play the card more often, but it's not really a staple. It's a card that very few specific decks would like to run, and not many others. Still, the card is really strong and frustrating, so leaving it banned is fine. It could lead to a lot of the same issues as limited resources, where it only locks 1 player of the game, sorta by accident, which is probably the biggest reason why the card stays on the ban list. Starting us off, we have Coalition Victory. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 3 and 1 mana of each color for a total of 8 mana. It has the effect where, if you control a land of each basic land type and a creature of each color, you win the game. This card was banned in March of 2007. Why was Coalition Victory banned? The card was much better at stealing games of Commander than in just about every other format. The thing that makes it so much easier to accomplish this is the fact that you have a Commander. The thing is, Victory doesn't ask you to have 1 creature for each color, it only checks to see for each color if one of your creatures is that color. So basically, if you have 1 creature that's all 5 colors, that's all you need for the Victory to go off on the creature front. As far as getting a land of each land type, that's really not very hard either. The best mana bases are built around the fetch lands, which work by searching lands from your deck based on their land types. Combining this with the shock lands and the triomes, which each have 2 or 3 basic land types respectively, and it's very easy to get all 5 land types in play. This leads to Coalition Victory basically saying 8 mana, win the game. The issue with this is that, in the eyes of the Rules Committee, This leads to very uninteresting and anticlimactic games. Now, this isn't something that would come up in most formats, but the casual nature of Commander makes it so this is more of a legitimate concern. Coalition victory kinda just comes out of nowhere. If you're playing a 5-color deck, no one's really going to blink twice at your commander being on the battlefield. And because people aren't really going to even notice if you have all 5 land types or not, the end result is that Coalition victory being live completely flies under the radar. Since the card was kind of just unfun and led to disappointing games, it was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Coalition victory? The main argument is that there are other cards that basically say with the game at this mana cost. Cards like Expropriate and Insurrection are usually just as game-winning due to the amount of value or damage they give you. And while this is true, there are a few notable differences. Namely, that those cards need more cards to be on board in order to close out a game. Coalition victory doesn't require anywhere near as much setup, as getting your commander out is very easy, and the land thing will usually be accomplished by accident. Still, this difference is pretty small. I could go either way on the card being banned. While it isn't actually that bad, it is still really annoying. I could see keeping it banned just to make the format a bit more fun. Next up, we have Biorhythm. This is a sorcery with the mana cost is 6 and 2 green. It has the effect where each player's life total becomes equal to the number of creatures they control. This card was banned in April of 2005. So, why was Biorhythm banned? It basically does what Coalition Victory does, but way worse. For the same amount of mana, Biorhythm will bring every player in the game to just a few life. If you then clear your opponent's board, Biorhythm will literally just kill them by setting their life to 0. If you use a card like Cyclonic Rift on your opponent's end step, or a card like the Great Aurora to reset the board and draw into your Biorhythm, your opponent's boards will be cleared of creatures. As long as you have at least one creature when you cast Biorhythm, you'll live while each of your opponents will die. What makes Biorhythm so much worse is that it's not restricted to only seen play in 5-color decks. Biorhythm can be shoved into any green deck, and it'll function as a powerful I win the game button in basically every creature-based deck. Another thing that makes it very annoying is how punishing it is for creature-light decks. Lots of decks are built around using very few creatures and playing a more controlling game plan, usually ending in some sort of combo. While actual control decks are rare in the format, tons of decks like Kess, Dissident Mage are often more focused on playing lots of powerful instants and sorceries than filling the board with creatures. So they're likely to only have a tiny bit of life after a Biorhythm resolves. The worst part of this is that your opponent doesn't even need to be doing anything for Biorhythm to basically just kill them, as they'd never have enough creatures to realistically live through the card. Due to how good it was at cheesing wins, Biorhythm was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Biorhythm? Very similarly to Coalition Victory, people argue that other cards win the game for the same amount of mana. A card that gets brought up a lot in these conversations is Shaman of the Forgotten Ways, which lets you pay 9 and 2 green for Biorhythm's effect if you have creatures with total power of 8 or greater. The argument is usually that Shaman doesn't see any play, so surely Biorhythm has to be fine, right? This is a really bad comparison though, for multiple reasons. Namely, Shaman has to sit on the field for a full turn to be able to activate, giving your opponent ample time to respond. The thing that makes Biorhythm difficult to deal with is that it just comes out of nowhere, similar to the other I win the game buttons we've talked about. All in all, Biorhythm could probably be mostly okay to come back. It's not too much worse than the other big expensive sorceries that players have access to. The main issue is that it's just one of the only cards in the category that can, by itself, actually kill a player. This is a unique function that puts Biorhythm in a category distinct from these other cards, but that's not that big of a deal. It's certainly a card that could come off the ban list and be fine, though it would be pretty annoying. Next up, we have Panoptic Mirror. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 5. It has the abilities where you can pay X and tap it to exile an instant or sorcery card from your hand. At the beginning of your upkeep, you can cast a copy of a card exiled with a mirror without paying its mana cost. This card was also banned in April of 2005. Why was Panoptic Mirror banned? Panoptic Mirror can easily win you the game if you imprint the right card onto it. Namely, what you're looking for is an extra turn spell. Since this will give you another upkeep, you'll get an extra turn on that extra turn, and then another one, and then another one, and so on and so on. Basically forever. Once you're taking all the turns in the game, you've basically won. Your opponent won't be able to do anything, and even if they do have mana for interactions, if they don't stop you the right way, you'll be able to wait until you've drawn the protection spells you need and have played enough lands that you'll be able to play around all their interactions anyway. Since this card was able to win you the game so easily, the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Panoptic Mirror? I'll be honest, I don't see why this one is still banned, as there are better and more efficient combos that can be slotted into tons of decks. Combos like Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Constellation let you win the game on the spot for just 3 mana, and are one of the most powerful and consistently used combos all the way up in CEDH. So, why aren't one of those 2 cards banned? Well, because they aren't played at casual tables that often. The worry with the previous random I win the game cards is that they'd see too much play at lower power level tables where they don't belong. So while these cards are far less powerful, they may be more problematic in a casual setting. So the real question is, would Panoptic Mirror see too much play at weaker tables? I really don't think so. There are tons of similar 2-card combos that win you the game that aren't banned that are about as useful as the pieces for the Mirror combo individually. For example, one of the most common combos for black decks is Sanguine Bond and Exquisite Blood. These are each 5-mana enchantments that make it so that gaining life makes your opponent lose that much life, and whenever your opponent loses life, you gain that much life respectively. These cards are great for any black deck that cares about gaining life, and see tons of play together and separately throughout the format. Though if you're playing Exquisite Blood, most people will toss in a Sanguine Bond effect for the heck of it anyway. So I really don't see any way in which Panoptic Mirror is more problematic than these other combo cards. It really seems like a fangless ban overall. Next up, we have Reoccurring Nightmare. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 2 and 1 black. It is the ability where you sacrifice a creature and return Recurring Nightmare to its owner's hand to return target creature card from graveyard to the battlefield. And also, you can only activate this card as a sorcery. This card was banned in February of 2008. Why was Reoccurring Nightmare banned? Nightmare was mostly banned due to how it works with priority. You see, how things work in Magic is that the active player, the player whose turn it is, gets to act first. And then each opponent in turn order gets to act each time a player gets priority. So what happens is a player casts Nightmare. That player gets a chance to act. Then each of their opponents do. If no one does anything, Nightmare will just resolve and go into play. Now, the messed up part is what happens next. Since it's your turn, you get to act first, and you can immediately activate Nightmare to reanimate something. The important thing here is that the returning Nightmare to your hand thing is technically a cost. So what happens is, as soon as the card resolves, you can bounce Nightmare to your hand before your opponents have a chance to do anything. This means that even if your opponent has something like Naturalized to answer your Nightmare, if you do the smart thing of always going right to activating your Nightmare, they'll never be able to pop it. The ability to get a repeatable reanimate that your opponent can't pop was extremely powerful, so the card was banned. Now, what are the arguments for unbanning Reoccurring Nightmare? I'll be honest, I really think the card should come back. I really don't think the card is problematic in any way. Sure, you can't interact with Nightmare with naturalized effects, but why exactly would you think that's how you'd want to answer the card? You answer the Nightmare the same way you answer other reanimation spells, with Graveyard Hate. Cards like Tormund's Crypt, Grafdigger's Cage, and Silent Gravestone are all colorless cards that answer graveyard interaction. Not only stopping Nightmare, but stopping all of the much more powerful reanimation spells in the format. Reanimate, Exhume, Animate Dead, and Persist are all better reanimation spells than Nightmare are. Nightmare would still be the 5th best reanimation spell in the format if it were unbanned. Now, some people would argue that getting to use it repeatedly makes it better, but this usually won't actually matter. If what you're trying to do is win the game, you should be saving your reanimation spells for cards like Protean Hulk or Razaketh the Foul-Blooded, cards that let you win the game 90% of the times when you get them in play. The ability to loop creatures in hand and out of your graveyard isn't really necessary for reanimation spells to do so. The fact that Reoccurring Nightmare encourages this is actually why it's perfect for the format. Nightmare encourages playing a very grindy, value-based game, which is what Commander is all about. The fact that it is repeatable is what makes it such a great fit for the format. While you can use it for getting out those powerful creatures, the fact that it shines the most in more value-based strategies will push people away from using it for combos, which leans more into what the format was designed for. Reoccurring Nightmare would add far, far more to the format than it would take away, and it would be an amazing unban. Next up, we have Gifts Ungiven. This is an instant with a mana cost of 3 and 1 blue. It is the effect where you search a library for up to 4 cards with different names. Target opponent chooses 2 of them. You put those cards into your graveyard and the rest into your hand, then shuffle. Gifts Ungiven was banned in June of 2009. Why was Gifts Ungiven banned? Gifts is so good at finding combo piles that if you cast it, you'll usually be able to win the game on the next turn. The line differs a ton based on exactly what deck you're playing. Storm decks that are built on casting lots of spells on one turn before killing the table with an Aetherflux Reservoir, will usually find piles with some numbers of rituals, draw spells, and most importantly, Past in Flames. This is a sorcery that gives all instants and sorceries in your graveyard flashback, where the flashback cost is equal to their mana costs. This lets you cast it from your graveyard, but you have to exile it afterwards. Most importantly, it has a flashback cost itself, so no matter where your opponent puts it, you'll be able to flashback your entire graveyard next turn. This is what makes Gifts so powerful. It basically lets you tutor for 2 cards if you really want to. You could just grab 2 cards you want and then 2 regrowth effects with different names so that you can just grab the cards from your graveyard right away. And considering how we've already talked about a number of 2-card combos in this video, it's obvious how easy it is to win the game after it gifts. What pushes it over the edge is the fact that it's an instant. This means that you can cast it at the end of your opponent's turn, right before your turn to set up your combo, and then untap and try to win the game. Thanks to just how strong this card was at letting the combo off and win, the card was banned. Now, what are the arguments for unbanning gifts Ungiven? One of the biggest sticking points in the discussion around the card is the fact that intuition exists and is completely legal. This is an instant with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue with the effect where you search your library for 3 cards, reveal them, then your opponent chooses one of those cards. You put that chosen card into your hand and the others into your graveyard. Intuition is a very old card, and a reserve list card at that, meaning Wizards has promised to never reprint the card. Combining this with the fact that it's basically a better Gifts Ungiven has caused a bit of a commotion in the community. The issue is that it seems very pay to win. You can still play this very powerful effect, but only if you shell out the very high amount of money for the older and harder to get intuition. You can't replace it with the cheaper option as you normally would in this case, since the cheaper version of the effect, Gifts Ungiven, is banned. This means that the player who's willing to pay more money is the only one who gets access to this effect, which doesn't make anyone happy. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that gifts should be unbanned. You could make a very strong argument that intuition should catch a ban alongside gifts. You could even make the argument that intuition should be banned and gifts should come off the ban list, since intuition is a more powerful card. On top of all this, it's debatable about how good Gifts Ungiven even is. Sure, it's a powerful combo enabler, but most of the combos it can set up do cost quite a bit of mana. It's not that much better than the other tutors in the format. Demonic Tutor is totally legal in the format and just lets you grab a card for half the mana with no questions asked. If Gifts was unbanned, CEDH would almost certainly pass it up in favor of the cheaper and more efficient tutors that are already available to them. The best response to this is, in my mind, that Gifts doesn't really do much besides let you set up big combos. Demonic Tutor can be used to find specific answers, like for example, finding the graveyard hit you really need to stop a Reanimator deck. Sometimes you won't be able to win off of a DT, so it makes sense to just stop your opponent from winning. Since Gifts finds so many cards, it only ever really makes sense to go find your 2-card combo, since you can always find both pieces. The best solution in my mind is just to hit both Gifts and Intuition, but just about every position here does at least have a leg to stand on. Starting us off, we have a pair of cards in Leovold, Emissary of Trust, and Hull Breacher. These cards were both banned for mostly the same reason. Starting with Leovold, this is a 3/3 Legendary Elf Advisor creature with a mana cost of 1 black, 1 green, and 1 blue. It has the abilities where your opponents can't draw more than 1 card each turn. And whenever you or a permanent you control becomes a target of an ability an opponent controls, you draw a card. This card was banned in April of 2017. Hull Breacher is a 3/2 Merfolk Pirate with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue. It has Flash, meaning you can cast it at any time you can cast an instant, and it has the ability where whenever an opponent would draw a card, except for the first card they draw during each of their draw steps, instead you create a treasure token. This is an artifact token with an ability where you can tap it and sacrifice and add 1 mana of any color. This card was banned in July of 2021. Now, why were these cards banned? These cards were both banned because of how they interact with wheel effects. Wheel is the name the community has given to cards like Wheel of Fortune that force all players to discard their hand and draw a new one. Of course, you may notice that with cards like Leovold and Hull Breacher out, this won't be possible, as they both stop your opponent from drawing cards. Leovold at least allows them to draw 1 card, while Hull Breacher will entirely stop them from drawing anything. And since these will effects will either force your opponent to discard their hand or shuffle their hand back to the deck, they'll end up with either 1 card or no cards in hand. While you'll be getting away with drawing an entirely new hand, and since most wheels hit the entire table, this usually wins you the game. However, if this was where the issue ended, these cards wouldn't have been banned. In CEDH, there are better ways to close the game, or at the very least, other win conditions that are as good as this. In fact, there are still other cards that have a very similar effect that are still legal in the format, such as Notion Thief, which allows you to draw a card instead of your opponent whenever you would draw a card outside of their draw step, and Narset, Parter of Veils, which just has the same text as Leovold at the same mana value. Both Leovold and Hull Breacher have something that make them better than these other cards. Leovold, being a legendary creature, is capable of being your commander, which makes all these combos far scarier and more consistent. Even without these combos, Leovold is already a good enough commander. Having the ability to just win the game whenever you want, on top of all the rest of the value, was just too much to deal with. Hull Breacher has Flash, making him far more difficult to play around. You can just cast him at the end step before your turn, after each other player has tapped out, and then perform the combo, pulling it off on turn 4 without giving your opponent a chance to respond. Faster than any other version of this effect can go off without having to pass your opponent and giving them a chance to play their cards out. So these cards may be the worst versions of these sorts of draw locking effects, But is the combo even bannable? After all, like we said, there are better combos available in the format. There are a couple of things that push this specific combo into the realm of being problematic. One, the combo is miserable to play against, and two, all the cards in the combo are things you'd want to play anyway, so they were seen playing tons of decks that other combos weren't. Speaking to the first issue, most combos that win the game actually do end the game. While refilling to 7 and putting all your opponents to 0 cards does basically end the game, it doesn't actually end the game. Your opponents will still have to sit there and basically do nothing for several turns as you slowly find an actual win condition. This is pretty miserable, but not necessarily enough to ban the card on its own. The thing that makes it so ban-worthy is the second issue, how playable all the cards in the combo are. Cards like Wheel of Fortune are incredibly useful cards that see tons of play in the format in a wide variety of decks, and these anti-draw effects are really strong even outside of the combos. The result was a ton of people who didn't normally play instant win combos still playing both these cards anyway, leading to this combo to see way more play at weaker tables. This caused a big issue at lower levels of play, and since a CEDH-ish combo was running around at mid-level tables, the cards were banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Leovold and Hullbreacher? The only real argument that people bring up is that cards like Narset are still legal, but that's usually in the context of wanting Narset banned as well. These types of cards are extremely hated. People hate any card that makes it so that you can't play, and these cards were really strong. Most of the community recognized the problem of combining these cards with wheels, but didn't have an issue with either half of their combos individually. This leads to a complicated situation where people have lots of different opinions on exactly how these cards should be handled on the ban list. However, most people are pretty happy to see these gone just because of how frustrating they are to play against. All this to say, this is one of the less controversial bans in the format. The main reason some would want them unbanned is that, from a more competitive perspective, there are bigger issues. It's not actually the most powerful combo in the format, and fun is a subjective term after all. Of course, this is Commander, and the format is more focused on making a fun, casual environment rather than a tournament setting. And the majority of people seem to agree that this type of gameplay isn't fun, so the cards are probably going to stay on the ban list. Next up we have Iona, Shield of Emeria. This is a 7/7 legendary angel creature with the mana cost of 6 and 3 white. It has flying, meaning it can't be blocked except by other creatures with flying or reach. And it has the abilities where, as Iona enters the battlefield, you choose a color. And the ability where your opponents can't cast spells of the chosen color. This card was banned in July of 2019. Now, why was Iona, Shield of Emeria banned? Iona was banned due to how it can shut out players from playing the game. While there are a lot of cards that can do this, Iona is a bit unique in the specific way it does this. The main thing is the card restricts actions based on color, which means that if an opponent is on a monocolored deck and you call that deck's color, they can only cast colorless spells for the rest of the game. The ability to just completely shut off another player is really annoying to play against, or in this case, not play against. While the card costing 9 mana is really high, there are tons of ways to cheat creatures into play quickly. Cards like Reanimate are completely legal in the format, and other forms of mana cheating like Molasses Citadel and Toothed Nail are pretty common in the format too. Getting Iona out isn't nearly as difficult as it may look. Iona is the kind of card that the rules committee really doesn't like running around, as it requires you to build your deck in very specific ways to get around the card. For all those reasons, Iona was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Iona? Now, this is one of the most contentious cards currently on the ban list. There are a few layers to this. First off, the card is seen as a signpost ban. Basically, more of a symbolic move than a card that was banned to actually change anything. You see, while Iona does have a strong lock effect, it's not even close to the strongest or most disruptive effect of this kind of the format. Cards like Stasis and Winter Orb have far more impact on the games they're played in and on the format as a whole. Both of these cards stop players from untapping their permanents, including their lands, meaning that no player can cast spells because they don't have any mana. Cards like Armageddon can destroy all the lands in play, also preventing anyone from playing anything. So why would they ban Iona rather than these other more impactful cards? Honestly, I have no idea what they were thinking. Iona is a very disruptive card, and it's just not worse in any meaningful way than any of the other cards. It seems like the only reason they would have banned this card is actually because of how weak it is. You see, stacks effects are really important for Commander at high-powered tables. Without these sorts of effects, the game usually just devolves into all-in combo decks. The only color that can compete with combos without these sorts of stacks effects is blue, thanks to its counter magic. Every other color has to rely on these lock pieces to slow the game down if they're not trying to combo off. So, if the RC had banned a card like Winter Orb, that could have risked actually messing up CEDH, whereas Iona, as a much weaker card, wouldn't change anything. But banning Iona does send a message, at least theoretically, that playing lock pieces is something RC doesn't want you to do. And honestly, this whole thing feels really silly. This is a very inconsistent ban, and even in terms of big expensive creatures with lock effects, cards like Void Winnower are just as disruptive and perfectly legal. Iona should probably just come off the list at this point, as her being banned isn't really doing anything. Next up we have Arayo Soritari Ascendant. This is a 1/1 legendary Moonfolk Monk creature with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It has flying and the ability Wear. Whenever the 4th spell of a turn is cast, you flip it. This means rotating 180 degrees into Io's Essence, a legendary enchantment. With the ability Wear, you counter the first spell each opponent casts each turn. This card was banned in September of 2011 as your commander, meaning it could still be played in your 99, but was moved to the normal ban list when this list was abolished in 2014. Why is Arayo banned? Well, because the flip version of the effect is basically impossible to play against. It's just way too easy to flip, and Arayo can be your commander. First off, casting 4 spells on a turn just isn't hard if you're actively trying to do this. If you play a bunch of cards like Ataxian Probe that cost 0 or 1 mana and cycle, you can pretty easily get up to 4 spell casts on turn 3 and still have plenty of room for a win condition in your deck. Once Arayo flips, you should probably just scoop if you don't have a good way to answer it right away. Having to get up the first spell you cast each turn makes it basically impossible to win. But even worse, makes it basically impossible to stop Arayo players from winning. If you want to develop your own board, you have to give up both an entire card and all the mana you spent on that spell, meaning you're basically going to be doing nothing most turns and losing a ton of cards. Even if you have a removal spell for Arayo right there, the Arayo player is playing blue, and probably has counter magic to protect their commander. However, it also makes interacting with that player on any player's turn basically impossible. If you have a removal spell or a counter spell, you can basically never actually play them. You'll have to develop another entire card in front of them to get them to resolve, and even if another player casts something, Arayo sees each opponent individually. So if the Arayo player is going for their combo and about to win, and even if each opponent has an answer, if one player doesn't have an answer and another castable spell, they can't actually do anything. And this is true for all 3 of that player's opponents. Basically, Arayo makes doing anything impossible for most of the players at a table. But unlike cards like Winter Orb, it's a valid commander. This means you will still have access to it every game, and be able to build your deck around it, making sure you make the most out of the card. There's no commander that's quite as disruptive as Arayo at its peak. Even Leovold isn't quite this bad. It's no wonder the RC decided to hit this card. What are the arguments for unbanning Arayo? The main argument would be probably the card isn't as good as it used to be, and while that is somewhat true, the card hasn't fallen off enough to be fair. I feel like people are underestimating how easy casting 4 spells in a turn actually is, especially since it counts spells being cast by all players, not just the Arayo player. You could also try to argue that the card mostly sees play at higher power level tables, so it would be less disruptive. The thing is, even at high-powered, non-CEDH tables, this card is really hard to play against, and people will play it there. The card may even still be an issue in CEDH, though that's not exactly my wheelhouse. Arayo is just too good of a card to have in your command zone. The best solution is probably bringing back the banned as commander lists, but that's another discussion. The bottom line is that Arayo cannot be allowed to be in the command zone. Next up, we have Upheaval. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 4 and 2 blue. It has the effect to return all permanents to their owner's hands. This card was banned in April of 2005. Why was Upheaval banned? The card is basically a super Armageddon, completely sending all players back to square one, but being much more powerful. It doesn't just get rid of all the lands, making it so the player can't cast spells until they replay their lands. It also gets rid of all other permanents on the board, so players won't have any threats left on the board, but possibly more importantly, it also gets rid of all mana rocks and mana dorks. This means that, unlike the mass land destruction spells, there's not really a way to still have some action after a player casts Upheaval. The only real way to get around Upheaval is with a card like Teferi's Protection, which is such a specific answer that you can't really rely on it to answer this card. On top of that, Upheaval is also just a really good card. Because you get to choose when Upheaval happens, you could make sure to put yourself in a good position to catapult ahead the rest of the table. Typically, what you would do is wait until you have around 8 or 9 mana. Then cast Upheaval without playing land for a turn. You would float all of your extra mana, and after the Upheaval resolves, you play land for turn and redeploy all your mana rocks. This would put you way far ahead on mana, as you were the only player who could redeploy after Upheaval with their extra mana. This all makes Upheaval quite possibly the most practical and powerful mass land destruction in the game, and for that reason, the card was banned. Now, what are the arguments for unbanning Upheaval? The main argument is that other mass land destruction and trolley cards are currently off the ban list, such as Armageddon and Worldfire. However, there are a few notable differences between Upheaval and those cards. The main difference is that it's far easier to make Upheaval good than any of those other cards, which may lead to it seeming more play than any other similar card. Upheaval answering the board makes it a lot more attractive in a lot of board states than typical mass land destruction spells. Armageddon will often leave you in a losing position if you cast it, so you have to make sure you're ahead on board enough to close out a game whenever you cast it, or that you found a way to protect your lands from its effects. Upheaval only asks that you have enough extra mana to redeploy some of your threats, which is way more manageable. In comparison to Worldfire, it's a lot easier to redeploy your threats after an upheaval since you'll still have a hand. This means you don't have to build around the card to anywhere near the same degree. Worldfire requires pretty specific cards to combo off, whereas Upheaval works with any spells. This means that Upheaval would be more likely to see far more play than Worldfire does. Basically, the card is meaningfully better than other similar effects, so it's likely to see more play and cause more problems than those other cards, though that's still a debatable topic. And finally, we have Sway of the Stars. This is a sorcerer with a mana cost of 8 and 2 blue. It is the effect where each player shuffles their hand, graveyard, and all permanents they control back into their deck, then draw 7 cards. Also, each player's life total then becomes 7. This card was banned in April of 2005. Why was Sway of the Stars banned? The card was banned for being really annoying to play against, plain and simple. The card doesn't have too many broken applications that other cards don't do better. Rather, a card that resets literally everyone's zones and sets each player to 7 life made it so that nothing that happened in the game up to that point where Sway resolved actually mattered. All that really matters at that point is whoever draws a good enough hand to close the game before anyone else. Considering that there's not much strategy in playing the card and how fun it is, the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Sway of the Stars? One big argument is that Worldfire was unbanned and has mostly been fine. Worldfire was banned for mostly the same reason as Sway of the Stars. So if it's okay, Sway is also probably okay. Now, to be honest, Sway being on or off the ban list is mostly a matter of personal preference. Worldfire does have some more straightforward combo implications due to setting people's life totals to 1, making it better at ending games, whereas Sway mostly only prolongs games. However, it's not that there's no combos with Sway of the Stars, even if they're more difficult to pull off. The card does have some legitimate applications, so the card being banned could be a sore spot for some players. Not to mention, there are cards like Thieves' Auction that similarly make the entire game up to the point they're played not matter, despite not actually being good. Ultimately, the card's banning feels extremely arbitrary, which may leave a lot of people to advocate for the card coming off the ban list. First up, we have Grizzle Brand. This is a 7/7 legendary demon creature with a mana cost of 4 and 4 black. It has flying and lifelink, meaning it can only be blocked by other creatures with flying, and if dealing damage, also causes you to gain that much life. It also has the ability where you can pay 7 life to draw 7 cards. This card was banned in June of 2012. Why was Grizzle Brand banned? Grizzle Brand is one of the most powerful creatures ever printed, and one that would only be even stronger in Commander. Paying 7 life to draw 7 cards is just so much card advantage that you can easily run away with the game. Even worse, this is usually enough for you to draw into some kind of combo to close out the game right there. This is true in most 60 card formats. But in Commander, this is even easier to do as you can draw twice as many cards with your inflated life total. Going to less than 10 life will make you pretty easy to kill, but if you can safely win the game before then it won't be much of an issue. This issue is only worsened by the fact that Grizzle Brand is a legendary creature, meaning it can both be your commander and it's very easy to cheat out without even paying the 8 mana for it. Just in black, you can use powerful reanimator effects to get Grizzle Brand out without paying the 8 mana. You also have cards like Entomb and Buried Alive to send cards directly from your library to the graveyard, letting you get Grizzle Brand out as soon as the first turn of the game with the help of some fast mana. You can do this with a lot of creatures, but Grizzle Brand's draw power makes it by far the best target for this kind of strategy. This isn't even to mention the other means of cheating creatures out, such as with Elvish Piper style effects and the like. Grizzle Brand is really one of the few creatures that's really just too powerful for the format. Whether it be in the Commander Zone or in the 99, the card really does need to stay banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Grizzle Brand? The main argument would be that cards of similar power are legal in the format and not banned anywhere. Some cards that do very similar things would be Razaketh the Foul-Blooded, which lets you pay 2 life and sacrifice a creature to search your library for any card and put it into your hand. This is about as powerful as Grizzle Brand's ability, and it's perfectly legal. So why is Grizzle Brand the only card banned? Well, Razaketh takes just a bit more setup to be able to use. The difference between paying life and paying life on top of sacrifice a creature is enough that Razaketh is slightly harder to make use of. Now, they are close enough in power that you could make an argument in favor of letting Grizzle Brand come back, but he would steal enough games that it probably wouldn't be a good idea. There are also cards like Necropotence available in the format, which does almost the exact same thing as Grizzle Brand, though there are a few important differences. The biggest one is that Necropotence gives you the cards at the end of the turn instead of right away, which means you have to wait a turn to combo off. There's also the issue of Grizzle Brand being available in the command zone, which isn't the biggest deal but does make it a bit easier to access than Necropotence is. To be perfectly honest, if Grizzle Brand is banned, Necro should maybe just get hit too, since they're a bit too close in power level to each other, but there are edges that Grizzle Brand has over Necro. All in all, Grizzle Brand is just a little bit too much and the best card for paying life to draw cards in the format. But you could argue that other cards also need to be hit or that it could come off. Next up we have Emerol, the Eon's Torn. This is a 15/15 legendary Eldrazi creature with a mana cost of 15. It has the abilities where it can't be countered, it has flying, protection from colored spells, meaning it can't be targeted or dealt damage by colored spells, Annihilator 6, meaning that whenever it attacks, the defending player sacrifices 6 permanents. And when you cast Emerol, you take an extra turn after this one. And whenever Emerol is put into the graveyard from anywhere, you shuffle your graveyard into your library. This card was banned in December of 2010. Now, why was Emerol banned? Emerol was just too strong overall, having far too much of an impact in any game where it's cast. Taking an extra turn when you cast it, in addition to having multiple forms of protections, means that you'll usually get to attack with Emerol if you cast it. This means you'll get to attack for 15 damage and get rid of 16 permanents from one of your opponent's boards, which is often enough for the player's game to basically be over. Similar to Grizzle Brand, you don't actually need to cast Emerol to get it out, meaning you can get this massive threat to play far earlier than turn 15. You can't reanimate Emerol quite as easily due to its shuffling effect, but all your other creature cheating effects will still work. The thing about Emerol is that it instantly made the entire game about answering this threat. You couldn't possibly ignore a resolved Emerol, as it will far too quickly eat up your board state and answer the game. It wasn't any one thing that the card did that made it too good, but rather that just did everything you could want. Due to how game warping Emerol was, the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Emerol? This is a case where the overall rise in the power level of the game is worth mentioning. Far fewer games of Commander are being won off the back of a fair mid-range strategy, slowly amassing a giant board and running over everyone. More and more people are running combos or semi-combos to try and win the game without actually going to combat, and the combat decks that do exist are getting faster and faster. Casting a 15 mana spell to end the game is, at this point, really reasonable. Cards like Coma, Cosmos Serpent take over the game for only 7 mana, and while the card isn't as impactful as Emerol is, for half the mana it's pretty reasonable. The format has caught up to Emerol in terms of power level, to the point where its place on the ban list feels like a relic of a bygone era more than anything. Next up, we have Braids Cabal Minion. This is a 2/2 legendary human minion with a mana cost of 2 and 2 black. It has the ability where, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices an artifact, a creature, or a land. This card was banned in June of 2009. Why was Braids banned? This card is really frustrating to play against, mostly due to how it slowly eats away to everyone's resources. Every turn, each player is going to lose a permanent, and while they can continue casting spells to try and develop their boards, a few bad draws will often be enough to make you start needing to sacrifice lands. Once you're sacrificing lands, you'll eventually be buried in an avalanche of sacrifice triggers as you slowly end up without any game actions. This is only made worse if the Braids players playing cards like Pox or Smallpox that force players to sacrifice lands and creatures and discard cards. Now, Braids is symmetrical, as are most of the cards they'd be playing alongside it, so the Braids player will also have to deal with all of this as well. And while there are ways to make this a winning strategy, whether or not it was good wasn't really why it was banned. It was more banned because the strategy was considered uncasual, or in other words, just unfun. There's nothing Commander players get more upset about than someone stopping them from completing their strategy, and denying your opponent's plays is all Braids does. Due to this, the rules committee saw Braids as a problematic card, and she was banned from the format. What are the arguments for unbanning Braids? Since the card isn't banned for power level reasons at all, the card's banning is far more contentious than other cards. There are certainly a number of people who like playing these kinds of decks and find these resource-style strategies fun, who would love to see the card come back. And it's hard to really have too much of a discussion about if the card should be banned or not, since to do that, you have to get into a larger discussion about game design. What is fun? What kind of experience should Magic and Commander as a format be geared toward? And how should the ban list play into that? There are very long and interesting conversations that the community has had time and time again, but they're a little beyond the scope of this series. The main takeaway is that the Braids banning is very subjective, and not something you can make very substantial arguments for without laying out a lot more about how you think about the game. The second major thing that needs to be talked about with Braids ban is the old banned as Commander rule. This worked about how it sounded. There were certain cards that were allowed in the 99, but were only banned as your commander. The rule was removed because the rules committee thought it would be too confusing for new players. To be straight to the point, this isn't very convincing. There are lots of things in Commander that are far more confusing than a second ban list that would only be a few cards long. Things like color identity rules would probably take a lot more work for a new player to learn, so getting rid of this very useful ban list for that reason seems silly. Braids would make far more sense on the banned as Commander list, since in the 99 it can simply be answered once and forgotten about. It being able to come back over and over again is a big part of making the resource denial strategy of the card work. Next up we have Golos, Tireless Pilgrim. This is a 3/5 legendary scout artifact creature with a mana cost of 5. It has the abilities where, when it enters a battlefield, you search your library for a land card and put it into the battlefield, then shuffle. It also has the ability where you can pay 2, a white, blue, black, red, and green to exile the top 3 cards of your library. For the rest of the turn, you can play those cards and you can play them without paying their mana cost. This card was banned in September of 2021. Why was Golos banned? This card was just the best commander for a generic deck in the format for several reasons. One, the card had a completely generic mana cost with the ability to tutor lands out of the deck. This makes Golos both a great source of mana fixing and mana ramp. This means that, even if you don't have the best mana base around, Golos could always fix your mana for you, making his second ability extremely easy to activate. The activated ability is extremely powerful, and on most turns, if you have the 7 mana available, which you probably will since Golos just ramped you, using the activated abilities will be the best use of your turn. Golos would make it so that one player just repeatedly casts giant, powerful spells for no mana investment on each of their turns. And if you did remove Golos, it didn't do much. Golos finding you a land drop allowed it to pay for most of its commander tax, as it would only cost 2 more mana each time. It could even pay for the entire tax if you found lands that tap for 2 mana, which are more common than you might think. Worst of all, you didn't even need to be playing a 5-color deck for Golos to be worth playing. If you were on a 2 or 3 color deck, you could just play a few cards like Mana Confluence to tutor out with Golos and only spend the mana to activate his ability. This made him extremely generic to the point where Golos was threatening the commander diversity of the format. Golos was basically a runaway value train that was very difficult to stop, and for that reason, the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Golos? The banning of Golos had as many people bemoaning it as celebrating it. A lot of people just didn't find Golos particularly egregious as a commander, as the card isn't really even that much of a powerhouse. Cards like Urza, Lord High Artificer, are much more powerful commanders that can do a lot more work in a game. And while Golos can get you a lot of value, that's not the most unique thing in the world. The card just wasn't the most powerful thing to be doing in the format, so hitting it over more egregious cards that took over more games more often didn't make much sense. Additionally, there are other 5-color commanders that don't require all 5 colors of mana to cast, such as Kenrith, the Returned King. Now, Golos is a little worse than Kenrith is, thanks to his ability to free cast spells and find lands from your deck, but they are close in how good they are at taking over games. This is a bit of a strange situation, since the ban is very much targeted towards lower to middle power tables, where Golos would often run away with games. Unfortunately, with this even more so than a lot of other bans, we have to defer to arbitrarity. In my own experience, Golos has been a thorn in the side of the format that forces players to raise the power level of their decks to just win faster than it can, or to hate the Golos player out of the game to have a chance. But personal experience isn't the strongest argument. This really gets to an issue a lot of players have with Commander ban lists in general, which is that Commander is such a large, diverse format that banning a card has massive ripple effects over tons of playgroups where the card may or may not have been a problem. Golos is generally accepted to be an overtuned card and a design mistake, but if it deserves a ban or not is far too subjective to make any objective statements on. Finally, we have Rofellos, Llanowar Emissary. This is a 2/1 legendary elf druid with a mana cost of 2 green. It is the ability where you can tap it to add 1 green mana for each forest you control. This card was banned in March of 2007. Why was Rofellos banned? This card was really good at ramping you in Commander, since you could just consistently cast it on turn 2 of every game. Rofellos would basically double your mana all on his own, as in a Rofellos deck, you would always play only forests for your lands. With twice as much mana, you'll be able to run away with the game in no time. Made even better by all of green lands ramping, letting you put even more forests into play. Mana doubling is an effect that you usually only get for 5 mana at the cheapest. Getting it on turn 3 is far too powerful, or at least it would be if it weren't for how easy it is to kill Rofellos. This is usually enough to keep the elf in check, but in Commander, he becomes far more potent. Being able to recast Rofellos anytime he's removed makes him a lot harder to deal with. This is true of most commanders, but with one that comes down so early and can run away with the game to this degree, it becomes a much bigger issue. This would make mono green decks just a little too good, so the card was banned to keep them in check. For this reason, Rofellos was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Rofellos? This is another commander that was originally banned as Commander, and one that most players would like to return to that status. In the 99, the card is a lot more manageable, though a tad on the stronger side. Still, in a format with Sol Ring legal, a one-off powerful ramp spell isn't really even worth writing home about. The other main argument for unbanning Rofellos, outside of just bringing back the old ban as a commander rule, is that the card was banned a long time ago, and the format has gotten a lot faster. Rofellos doesn't by himself let you win the game. He only lets you cast powerful spells early, which, while good, is something that a lot of decks are probably ready to deal with. Now, while this is true, Rafellas is probably a bit too much. It really does require an early removal spell, as unless the Rafella player has a really weak hand, they'll probably rocket really far ahead of the rest of the table, possibly winning the game before anyone else can find an answer. While it's not as good as it used to be, having Rafellas in the command zone would probably still be too much, especially at lower power level tables. First off, we have Paradox Engine. This is a legendary artifact with a mana cost of 5. It has the ability where, whenever you cast a spell, you untap all non-land permanents you control. This card was banned in July of 2019. Why was Paradox Engine banned? There are two big issues with this card. The first is the combination of how powerful it is and the effect it has on the games when it hits the field. What would usually happen is a player would tap a lot of mana rocks to cast Engine and then follow up with another spell. This would untap all those mana rocks, letting you cast yet another spell, and so on, so as long as you had spells to continue casting. There are ways to make this even more consistent, such as using cards like Isochron Scepter. This is an artifact that allows you to exile an instant or sorcery that costs 2 or less when it enters the battlefield, and you can pay 2 and tap it to cast a copy of the exiled card without paying its mana cost. With the Paradox Engine out, every time you activate Scepter, you'll get to untap it and all your other permanents, as Scepter does technically cast the copied spell. If you put a card like a Lightning Bolt under your Scepter, you can just burn all your opponents to death with this combo, winning on the spot. And while this is very powerful, the real issue here is honestly just how easy it is to make the engine way too good. As long as you have a few non-land permanents you can tap for mana, you can usually just storm off and put together some kind of combo, or just get so ahead on board that it's impossible for your opponents to ever come back. The cherry on top of all of this is just how long Paradox Engine turns take to complete. Players with an engine on the field will often take turns that are 3 or 4 times as long as any other player at the table. It's very similar to the issue with Prophet of Cruix, which just made one player take over the entire game and plays way more than everyone else. This is where the second main issue that was alluded to earlier comes in. The card is colorless, meaning it can be played in literally any deck. This led to Paradox Engine being played all over the place in basically any deck that wanted to go off and extend their board state. The combination of how heavily played the card was, and how many bad games it led to, result in the card being banned from the format. What are the arguments for unbanning Paradox Engine? The argument that Engine slows down the game is a bit hard to pin down and quantify, leading a lot of people to argue that cards shouldn't be banned for this reason. In fact, there are still lots of combos and strategies that you can employ in the format that have a very similar effect. What made Paradox ban-worthy in the eyes of the rules committee is likely how widespread the card's usage is. Basically, every deck could play Engine, and it would make the deck better, which meant that it was leading to these kinds of games a lot more often than other cards. Sure, cards like Tulane Teller of Tales can have a similar effect on games, but this is one specific commander, rather than a format staple that as much as all 4 players in a pod could be playing. Another argument is a less popular one, but still worth bringing up. The card was very strong in CEDH, and the banning hurt that side of the format in some people's eyes. The Rules Committee has said that they don't consider CEDH when banning cards, at least for the most part. The Paradox Engine banning had an overall positive effect on the format, but there were certainly several pain points, so it's understandable why some people want the card back. Next up, we have Primal Titan. This is a 6/6 giant with a mana cost of 4 and 2 green. It has trample, meaning it can deal excess combat damage to the defending player or planeswalker. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you can search your library for up to 2 land cards, put them into the battlefield, and then shuffle. This card was banned in September of 2012. And while we're here, we should also talk about a very similar card in Sylvan Primordial. This is a 6/8 avatar with a mana cost of 5 and 2 green. It has reach, allowing it to block flying creatures, and has the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, you destroy target non-creature permanent an opponent controls. Then, for each permanent destroyed this way, you search your library for a forest card and put it in the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Why were Primeval Titan and Sylvan Primordial banned? These cards were mostly banned due to how they warp the game around them. The enter the battlefield triggers on these cards are so powerful that the best thing to do when they hit the battlefield was to clone them, steal them, blink them, do basically anything with them. The cards put you so far ahead in terms of mana with their triggers that you would, after a few uses of the cards, be able to cast multiple expensive, powerful spells in a single turn. This is even more important in Commander than it is in other formats, thanks to how the higher life totals and multiple opponents affect the format. We've mentioned this at several points, but Commander as a format requires far more explosive plays and cards to bring a game to a close. Getting extra mana is an effect that's really powerful, and these cards are so efficient in terms of mana production that it ended up being better to do things with them instead of just doing about anything else. Thanks to the effect it's had on games, the cards were banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Primal Titan and Sylvan Primordial? This is a case where the power creep of the format really matters. We have more powerful mana ramp now than we've ever had, and threats, removal, combos, basically everything has crept up on them. The mana off of these cards is a lot less game winning than it used to be. Additionally, there are other cards that are probably just more powerful and do the same thing, but much worse. The best example would be Dockside Extortionist, a 2-drop that makes you a treasure for each artifact and or enchantment your opponent controls when it enters the battlefield. These are tokens that you can tap and sacrifice for 1 mana of any color. Extortionist will usually make far more than 2 treasures when it comes in, often upwards of 5 or more treasures, and this mana is usually enough to propel you into a winning position. Copying and flickering Extortionist is usually just better than Titan or Primordial, so it's strange that these cards are banned while it's completely legal. So, those are all the cards that are only banned in Commander, though there are some cards that are banned in other formats that we've talked about already. So, since we've already covered these cards so many times, we're going to go over all the rest of the banned cards in a sort of lightning round, spending just a little bit less time talking about them. First off, we have the infamous members of the Power 9, 8 of which are banned in Commander. The Moxen, Mox Pearl, Mox Sapphire, Mox Jet, Mox Ruby, and Mox Emerald are all 0 mana artifacts you can tap to add 1 mana of their respective color. These were all banned in April 2005. Now, why were the Moxen banned? There are 2 major issues, the first of which is pretty interesting. You see, the Moxen were partly banned just because of how expensive they are. The Rules Committee isn't part of Wizards of the Coast, and are therefore not legally bound to pretend that the secondary market doesn't exist. This means they can openly make decisions based on things such as availability of cards. And cards like the Moxen, which can individually each go for upwards of $2,000, are on the reserved list, meaning Wizards can't reprint them without legal trouble. This obviously means that the Moxen are very scarce and hard to get a hold of, and the RC didn't want Commander to seem like a luxury format that only the extremely wealthy people could afford to play. And since the Moxen would have been kind of broken in the format, they went ahead and banned them. This does lead to the next question. Why are the Moxen too broken? We've talked about this before, but Moxen are essentially lands that don't take up a land drop. Playing a Mox instead of a land means that you're a turn ahead in terms of mana reduction for the rest of the game, leading to having a pretty huge upside over your opponents. People already talk about banning Soul Ring and Mana Crypt thanks to them basically doing the same thing. So putting more cards with that kind of impact in the game into the format would be a really bad idea. As far as arguments for unbanning the Moxen go, no one really wants them unbanned. The price on top of having an almost entirely negative impact on the format means that there's not much of a reason to let them back into the format. Next up we have Black Lotus, a 0 mana artifact with ability where you can tap and sacrifice it at 3 mana of any one color. This was banned at the same time as the Moxen in April 2005, as were the rest of the Power 9 with the sole exception of Time Twister. Why was Black Lotus banned? The card was banned for basically all the same reasons as the Moxen, except even more so. Black Lotus is the second most expensive Magic card in existence, making the availability issue even worse. It also makes way too much mana far too quickly. While it doesn't make consistent mana, the burst of mana it gives you allows you to put combos together extremely early, or ramp into even more powerful ramp spells early, or doing any number of extremely broken things. Black Lotus would lead to far more non-games on top of giving a very small subset of players a huge advantage. And similar to the Moxen, no one really wants the card unbanned. Next up, we have Time Walk. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It is the effect where you take an extra turn after this one. Now, why was Time Walk banned? Beyond a lack of availability, Time Walk causes 2 major issues. The first is the effect of the color pie. The color pie is one of the most important things in Magic, and one of the selling points of the game from a design standpoint. However, the appeal of the game goes away if one color is obviously way better than all the others, and from a competitive standpoint, it leads to a stagnant format with very low deck diversity. Time Walk is just a very unfair card, doing far too much for far too little mana. It's hard to explain why Time Walk is so good, but the best way to think about it is realizing just how low the floor is. Time Walk is, at worst, a free explore. It draws you a card and lets you play an additional land, just like Explore does, for the same amount of mana. However, it also untaps your other lands afterwards, letting you do even more on that turn. At worst, Time Walk is a better version of an already very playable card. In the best case scenario, the card can literally win you the game, as an extra turn is one of the best effects in all of Magic. All of this is to say that Time Walk is one of the most broken cards Wizards has ever printed. While this is a big issue in a competitive format, in a casual format like Commander, it causes a different kind of problem. Time Walk is powerful enough that it makes playing blue noticeably better than playing the other colors. And while this effect is dampened by being a 99 card singleton format, it's still noticeable. The effect is mostly psychological. Why would you choose to play any non-blue deck when playing a blue deck gives you access to cards that are clearly just far better than any other color? Commander already has issues with color balance that Wizards is trying to hammer out. Having cards like Time Walk that are still noticeably stronger than any other card only make the discrepancies even more noticeable. All in all, Time Walk will just have a very negative impact on the format. Next up, we have Ancestral Recall. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 blue. It is the effect where target player draws 3 cards. Why was Ancestral Recall banned? Recall's ban is basically identical to why Time Walk is banned. It's a combination of being very expensive and being way too strong, making blue far too strong of a color. Now, in Commander specifically, Recall is noticeably weaker than Time Walk is, as taking an extra turn scales better in the multiplayer format than drawing extra cards does. Still, this doesn't change the facts of the matter. Recall is still a very unfair card. By far the best card draw effect in the game. It would feel very unfair for blue to get access to this kind of card where every other color has to actually pay a reasonable cost to draw their cards. That seals all of the Power 9 that are banned in the format. The next section of cards I'd like to quickly go over are the Dexterity cards, Falling Star, and Chaos Orb. Falling Star is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 1 red with the effect where you flip it onto the playing field area from a height of at least 1 foot. It deals 3 damage to each creature it lands on, and you tap all those creatures. However, if it doesn't flip over at least once during the flip, it has no effect. Chaos Orb is an artifact with a mana cost of 2. It has the effect where you can pay 1 and tap it to flip it onto the table from a height of at least 1 foot. You destroy all non-token permanents as touching when it lands, then destroy Chaos Orb. But you can only do this if it's flipped all the way over at least once as well. These were also both banned in April 2005 along with the Power 9 cards. So why are these cards banned? They're banned for the exact same reason they're banned in every other format. They don't belong in Magic. Dexterity just isn't a skill that Magic designers want to test, as it feels really far outside the bounds of how the game normally works. Not to mention, there are tons of issues caused with these cards that go beyond this. First off, there's no question of when you're allowed to move your cards around in a format with these cards. There aren't many rules about where you're allowed to place your cards on the mat or when you're allowed to move them in the Magic rulebook, outside of a few things meant only to keep communication between players smooth and effective. This means that in a format with these kinds of cards available, the most optimal way to play this is with all of your cards a full card's length away from each other. That way any Dexterity card will only ever land on one of your permanents. This is extremely annoying, especially in Commander where boards get so much larger than they normally do. All of these attributes together make it so the Dexterity cards don't really have a place in the format. Now, as far as unbanning these cards go, this is a bit interesting. Mainly because if there ever was a Magic format where the Dexterity cards were illegal, it would be in Commander. As a casual format, a lot of the worst parts of logistical issues with the cards don't come up. For example, there aren't really many tournaments for Commander, and taking up too much space in tournament settings are one of the big reasons why the card needs to be banned. So the cards do have less issues in the Commander format. However, the way that the cards clash with what many players want out of a game of Magic. While it could theoretically work, most players would probably prefer if the cards just stayed banned. Starting us off, we have Tolarian Academy. This is a legendary land with the ability where you can tap it to add 1 blue for each artifact you control. This card was banned all the way back in June of 2010. So why was this card banned? Academy was really good at making a lot of mana fast, an attribute that's gotten a ton of cards banned. Academy is a part of a cycle of lands with very similar abilities alongside Gaia's Cradle and Serra's Sanctum. Cradle taps for 1 green for each creature you control, whereas Sanctum taps for white equal to the number of enchantments you control. Both of these cards have already shown themselves to be very powerful in Commander. Basically, if you're playing a deck built around either creatures or enchantments, you should be playing the card, as they just offer way too much mana for way too little cost. Academy takes this up to 11. For one, there are plenty of powerful 0 mana artifacts that can be used to power up your Academy, making it far easier to get an Academy tapping for unfair amounts. Making this even worse is the fact that artifact-based decks tend to be very strong anyway. One of the most broken commanders in the format is Urza, Lord High Artificer, due to his ability to tap your artifacts for mana. Giving these decks access to Academy would just let them close games even faster and easier. The card can also kind of just be played in any blue deck, as most decks in the format are already playing a good number of artifacts anyway. Most decks are already playing a Soul Ring and a Mana Crypt, or at least would be if Crypt weren't quite pricey. On top of that, tons of other decks will be relying on Signets to ramp them. The point is that there just isn't much deck building cost to making Academy work. Due to how overwhelmingly powerful the card is and how easy it is to use, the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Tolarian Academy? There aren't really many people who want the card back. The card is banned basically everywhere because it's just far too good and too easy to break. The only angle where unbanning it really makes sense is just from wanting a shorter ban list. But Academy is a very reasonable ban. The card would be bad for both casual and competitive players, so there's not really a reason to bring it back. Next up, we have Yawgmoth's Bargain. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 4 and 2 black. It is abilities where you skip your draw step and you pay 1 life to draw a card. This card was banned in May of 2006. Why was Yawgmoth's Bargain banned? Well, it doesn't take long to see the comparison to Grizzle Brand, another card on the Commander ban list. The ability to draw as many cards as you want just by paying life is always powerful, but it's even better in Commander where players' life totals are inflated. Drawing 20 or so cards is usually enough to just win the game. either through some sort of combo or just having too many threats and answers for your opponent to keep up with. Of course, this applies equally both to Grizzle Brand and Bargain. When compared to Grizzle Brand, Bargain has a few notable upsides and downsides. Grizzle Brand doesn't lock your draws and can be cheated into play more easily thanks to various reanimate effects. However, Bargain costs less mana up front, which makes it castable in a lot of situations where other similar cards simply aren't. However, the main reason the card was banned was just because of how powerful the draw itself is. What are the arguments for unbanning Yawgmoth's Bargain? There's one very strange point surrounding Bargain's ban, and its name is Necropotence. This card has basically the same effect as Bargain, except it puts the card into your hand at the end of the turn and only costs 3 black mana, not a full 6 mana. In just about every conceivable way, Necropotence is just better than Bargain. The only edge Bargain has is drawing the cards right away, which just doesn't matter when the cards come down so much later. Even worse, at high levels of play, Necropotence has an even greater edge because it's tutorable off of Zur the Enchanter, who is a legendary creature and therefore a valid commander. With all of this in mind, there aren't really any good reasons for Bargain to remain banned, while Necropotence is completely legal. You could argue that Necro should be banned alongside Bargain, but it's kind of arguable. Overall, it just doesn't make sense for Necropotence to be off the list while Bargain is on it. Next up, we have Tinker. This is a sorcerer with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue. As an additional cost to cast Tinker, you have to sacrifice an artifact. It has the effect where you search a library for an artifact, put it into the battlefield, and then shuffle. This card was banned in March of 2009. Why was Tinker banned? Being able to tutor an artifact directly into play is very powerful, and Tinker doesn't ask for anywhere near a high enough cost to make the effect fair. We've already gone over how common artifacts are in the format thanks to artifact mana. It should maybe go without saying, but there are tons of very powerful artifacts to find off of Tinker. Some of the highlights would be cards like Bolas's Citadel, which lets you cast spells from the top of your library for no mana by paying life, or even cards like Portal to Phyrexia, which forces each opponent to sacrifice 3 creatures when it enters the battlefield and reanimates a creature each turn. So you have a card that can find game-ending threats and put them into play for very little mana, and has a very small deck building cost in order to make work, namely playing some of the best cards in the format. This isn't even getting into the versatility of the card and how it can be used to respond to a ton of different situations. For all of these reasons combined, the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Tinker? This is another card that's hard to find a good reason to unban. The card is banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage for good reason. It makes artifact decks extremely powerful and can steal games out of nowhere very easily. There's not really any world I can see where the card would be unbanned and be okay. Next up is Time Vault. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 2. It has the abilities where it enters the battlefield tapped. Time Vault doesn't untap during your untap step, and if it would begin a turn while Time Vault is tapped, you can instead skip that turn and untap Time Vault. Finally, you can tap the Vault to take an extra turn. This card was banned in December of 2008. Why was Time Vault banned? There are 2 reasons for this. The first is that the card is just broken. All you have to do is play any card that could untap Time Vault once a turn, and you can take infinite turns, effectively winning the game on the spot. There are so many cards that can do this, to the point where you can be rest assured if you ever draw your Time Vault, you'll be able to go infinite. This alone might be enough to ban the card, but there's also an accessibility issue. This is a reserved list card, and one that was only printed twice, once in Unlimited and again in a collector's edition. And the collector's edition print isn't even tournament legal. Vaults will set you back several $100s, and that's something that would only get worse with time. Unbanning this card would require players to either proxy or cough up far too much money on a single card to compete. While Commander isn't a very competitive format, people do want games to be a bit fair, and this kind of lopsided card would hurt games a lot. For all of these reasons, the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Time Vault? This is another very uncontroversial ban. Not only is the combo broken, it's also not fun to play against. Watching your opponent take infinite turns until they find an actual way to win is just very boring. The combination of being far too strong and the fact that almost no one owns copies of the card means that no one is pushing for the card to come off the ban list. Next up, we have Library of Alexandria. This is a land with the abilities where you can tap it for 1 colorless mana, and you can tap it to draw a card, but only if you have exactly 7 cards in hand. This card was banned in April of 2005. Why was this card banned? The accessibility issue is even worse here. This card has only ever had 1 printing and runs for around the price of a used car. And no, that's not an exaggeration. Outside of being too difficult to get a hold of, the card is also very good. You lose basically nothing, but in the right circumstances, it can push you extremely far ahead. Drawing an extra card every turn is a great effect, and the restriction of needing 7 cards in hand isn't the hardest thing in the world to get to work. The thing is, even if it doesn't go your way, it doesn't really matter. Even if you never draw a card off of library, you haven't lost anything by playing it. It doesn't hurt you at all, so the only cost is opportunity cost. Considering the card costs you nothing to play, at least within the terms of the game, and can just win entire games on its own, the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Library of Alexandria? This is a bit of a weird case, as the biggest issue nowadays really is just the accessibility. The power level of the card isn't all that high. It's a lot harder to keep yourself at 7 cards in hand and keep drawing than it used to be, and even more difficult in multiplayer formats. If the card were more accessible, it would be contentious, but it might not ever get banned. The main problem is only the fact that to reasonably play it, you have to bust out the old Sharpie on basic land trick. Next is Fastbound. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 green. It has abilities where you can play any number of lands on each of your turns, but whenever you play a land, if it wasn't the first land you played that turn, Fastbound deals 1 damage to you. This card was banned in June of 2009. Why was Fastbound banned? While this isn't a reserved list card, it's a bit easier to get a hold of than some of the last entries. This card is mostly banned for power level reasons, as it's very easy to combo off with Fastbound. The easiest way to do this is to use some way to sacrifice lands with a card that lets you play lands from your graveyard. Basically, this just lets you cycle lands in and out of your graveyard as many times as you have a life for, or even infinitely as long as you have a way to gain life along the way. Once you do this, you can use your infinite mana to win the game, or maybe win through infinite landfall triggers. Of course, this is another card where you don't have to go infinite with a card to be worth it. Sometimes just playing out all the lands in your hand on turn 1 is enough to put you in a winning position. Fastbound is one of those cards that never does anything fair. It only really leads to one player either winning right away, or it's just a dead card, due to just how easy it is to win because of the card, it was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Fastbound? This is a card that's just too good for the format. Green really doesn't need any more busted land ramp cards. Giving the color this on top of everything else that's going for it would make the color far too strong and casual. And while CEDH isn't the biggest consideration, there's a good chance it would be far too good there too. Next up we have Flash. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It is the effect where you put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. Then you sacrifice it unless you pay its mana cost minus 2 generic mana. This card was banned in April of 2020. Why was Flash banned? Flash was banned due to how it interacted with one card in particular, Protean Hulk. Hulk is a 6/6 for 5 and 2 green with the ability where, when it dies, you search your library for any number of creature cards with total mana value 6 or less, put them into the battlefield, and then shuffle. Though, it might as well just say, when this dies, you win, because that's how it plays out in practice. The combo lines have changed a lot over time, but suffice to say that there's always been a way to win the game when Hulk dies. Flash and Hulk together, then, allow you to win the game at instant speed for 2 mana, which is as good as it sounds. This wasn't an issue in casual play, but in CEDH, it was basically destroying the format. Flash Hulk was one of the only things worth doing in the format, and the mirror was pretty miserable. If one player attempted to go off, any other players holding the combo could go off in response. Most games were essentially a Mexican standoff, with 2 or more players holding a proverbial gun to each other's throats. There was some contention on if the rules committee should ban cards for the CEDH community, but since no one was really playing Flash, they decided it was fine to ban. What are the arguments for unbanning Flash? This one has an interesting story, because Protean Hulk was banned in the format for years. However, right as it was reprinted in Masters 25, the card was released back in the format, as it was thought that it should probably be fine. Of course, it turned out to be doing the exact same thing it always did. It really makes one wonder why they ever unbanned Hulk in the first place. Flash had been around for years without doing anything, but then they unbanned the one card it had ever seen play with and it had to be banned. Hulk really seems to be the problem card in the interaction here. Next up, we have Channel. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 green. It is the effect where, until the end of the turn, anytime you can activate a mana ability, you may pay 1 life. If you do, you add 1 colorless mana. This card was banned in June of 2010. Why was Channel banned? This is basically the opposite version of Yawgmoth's Bargain, giving you mana for life instead of giving you cards for life. This does basically the same thing, which is let you win the game right then and there. It's a little bit more difficult to make work, and often you hold back on your channel until later in the game instead of slamming it as soon as you can. Still, it allows you to do things like infinitely recast Ancestral Statue with an Aetherflux Reservoir on the board to eventually gain infinite life, and then laser down each of your opponents one by one. While this might be problematic at high levels of play, it's possibly worse at casual tables, where it can be used to cast a ton of cards like Ungiven the Spear Dragon and Kozilek Butcher of the Truth on turn 2. While this won't always let you win the game, it usually will. The ease with which Channel can end games out of nowhere led to the card being banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Channel? Well, there's not much clamoring for the card to come back. While it might not be as good as other combos already available in CEDH, it probably would be problematic in casual play. And that's what the Commander ban list is supposed to be designed for anyway. There just doesn't seem to be a good outcome that would come from unbanning Channel. Next up, we have Balance. This is a source with a mana cost of 1 and 1 white. It is the effect where each player chooses a number of lands they control equal to the number of lands controlled by the player who controls the fewest, then sacrifices the rest. The players discard cards and sacrifice creatures the same way. This card was banned in April of 2005. Why was Balance banned? Balance is very good at leaving your opponent with no meaningful game actions. If you spend the first 2 turns of the game playing out artifacts, emptying your hand, and not playing creatures, then casting Balance will often force your opponent to discard their entire hands and sacrifice all their creatures. And if you find a way to get rid of most of your lands, you can basically make it an Armageddon too. Getting all of this for 2 mana can put you really far ahead, especially if you've been playing powerful artifacts beforehand. This is particularly bad at more casual tables where players will be less prepared to play against these kinds of effects. Stacks effects are very common in CEDH, whereas they are heavily discouraged in casual games. As a result, players in casual games don't play the kind of cheap interaction and card draw needed to stand a chance against these kinds of cards. Due to how disruptive the card can be to games, it was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Balance? There's not much. The card would probably be fine in CEDH, but that's not what the ban list is for. For casual play, the card is a worse version of basically every effect people hate in the game. Balance is probably the poster child for cards that stops you from playing, so it's not a surprise that it's banned in the format. For the final card in the series, we have the infamous Shahrazad. This is a source with the mana cost of 2 white. It is the effect where players play a magic sub-game, using their libraries as their deck, and each player who doesn't win the sub-game loses half their life, rounded up. This card was banned in December of 2005. Why was Shahrazad banned? I feel like this one is pretty self-explanatory. I just want you to imagine this. You're nearing the end of a nearly 2-hour long game of Commander with your friends. Players have come close to winning several times, only to be barely stopped at the last second. Suddenly, a player casts Shahrazad. What kind of play experience do you think that's going to have? Frustrating is putting it far too lightly. Shahrazad favorably does nothing but waste everyone's time. Games that would normally only be a couple hours long, an already ridiculous amount of time for any card game to take, and something that people says needs to be fixed in the format, and extends it to a quite possibly twice that length. It's not like Shahrazad even has much of an impact on the game it's played in, as players losing half their life is bad, but not necessarily game ending. From a practical perspective, it's even worse. Commander board states tend to get pretty big. You'll need 2 full-size kitchen tables to resolve Shahrazad's effect, one to hold the first game, and one to hold the sub-game. Honestly, if someone casts this card in the game I was playing, I might just scoop right there. What are the arguments for unbanning Shahrazad? Well, it's not technically broken, it's not the most powerful effect out there, and you might try to argue that if there are cards that waste people's times like Thieves' Auction in the format, why not let Shahrazad in? However, the practical concerns alone are enough for the card to be banned. It has a much worse effect on games it's played in than other cards that tend to be frustrating to have resolved. Shahrazad might not be the most powerful card in Magic, but it's still the most disruptive to play. Alright, and that's the series. A quick thanks to everyone for watching, and as always, if you have any thoughts or ideas for future videos like this one, we'd love to hear about them down in the comments below.